Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Gutsy Christianity with your host, Rosa Hopkins. This episode is brought to you by ChoiceWriters.com, a blog writing service where you can find elegant copy from the best writers. Again, that is ChoiceWriters.com. And you can also find me, Rosa Hopkins, on Facebook at Facebook.com/Rosa Hopkins Writing. And you can also find my blog at GutsyChristianity.com. So today I wanted to talk about some lessons from the life of the prophet Elijah. And the theme is if faith alone healed depression. So we come to the Bible story of Elijah, and to put it bluntly, Elijah wanted to die. He had had enough, and he asked God if he would take his life. And so I can easily see that if the prophet Elijah were alive today, and if he were a minister expounding on the word of God and the gospel and the scriptures today, we would accuse this prophet of simply not having enough faith. And unfortunately, this viewpoint is so erroneous that it fails to take into account the fact that many prophets were found to dwell deeply in the pit of despair. And if anybody had faith, it would have been these very men of God, and yet they were not immune to a most profound and utter despondency. So when we look in the scriptures, we see that David and Jonah were two great men of God who also at times experienced the dark night of the soul and did not delight in the day-to-day that life had to offer. And so it's very interesting that the angel comes to Elijah and he speaks to him. The very first thing that he said to him was to get up and to eat. And so the day prior, Elijah had traveled a day's journey into the wilderness. Queen Jezebel had threatened his life, and besides being overwhelmed and frightened, he also believed that he was the only prophet of the true God who was left. And so Elijah had initiated a contest between the one true God and the prophets of Baal to see who would be able to show that they, in fact, had sovereignty over the nations. And what Elijah did was he had gathered these various prophets of Baal, and they spent the entire morning calling out to their gods. And Elijah mocked them, saying maybe they should yell a little bit louder. Maybe he was in the bathroom and couldn't hear him. And they would cut themselves, make themselves bleed, drive themselves absolutely crazy in an attempt to get their gods to hear them and to consume the offering that had been laid out. And so, long story short, it never happens. But then when Elijah calls on his God, the one true God, Jehovah God, he is able to consume not only the sacrifice, but also the altar had previously been dipped, or rather it had been soaked in water. The logs had been soaked in water so as to not start a fire. And so that was the strength of Elijah's faith, that God was indeed going to consume this offering. So God does that, and the contest is settled. God is the one true God, and Baal is not. Well, then what they did was they gathered the prophets of Baal, and they slew them. So they killed the prophets of Baal. Queen Jezebel has an absolute fit, and she threatens Elijah's life personally and says, may the gods do so more to her by tomorrow if by this day she hasn't gotten the prophet Elijah and destroyed his life. So he's absolutely afraid. So he takes off, he leaves his helper behind, and he runs a day's journey into the wilderness. So that's where we find him, where when he's confronted with God, he just says, let me die. I just want to die. He was to the point of being suicidally depressed. And so he was obviously overwhelmed and frightened, but he also believed that he was the only prophet of the true God who was left. And we find that out later. Because he'll have a conversation with God where God asks him, what is he doing there in the cave? Because he was there in a cave, hiding himself away from the world, and he expressed to God that he was the only prophet left that had not bent the knee to Baal or kissed him. So that's very important. He thinks that he's the only one left, the only one who has remained faithful to God. And so that creates a sense of isolation. It creates a sense of despondency. He's depressed. He's exhausted. He's afraid. And so what it's done, all of these things working together have wreaked absolute havoc on his body and his emotions. And that's completely understandable, especially as the scriptures say that Elijah was a man subject to like passions as are we. That's James 5:17. And so what happens with Elijah at that point, he wasn't told by God to simply just have more faith and get over it. After he spoke with the angel, 1 Kings 19:6 says, he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. And so I find that extremely compassionate, as people with depression often find the task of self-care to be unattainable, and things like food preparation can be absolutely daunting. And yet it's so vital. And sometimes that first step is it just feels like an impossibility. And so food, nourishment, hydration, these are key elements to making sure that our bodies have the proper nutrition that they need to function in the way that they need to. Adequate rest is also important. So we see that he had bread, he had water, so that's food, and hydration, and then he ate and drank and then lay down again. So he's sleeping, he's getting enough rest. So once he eats, drinks, he does so again. A second time he eats and he drinks some more, and then he lays down to rest again. And then after that, he travels for 40 days and 40 nights to a cave where he shuts out the world. So it's at this point where God intervenes, and we know that sometimes depression can make us numb to our surroundings, and we also have this desire to hide ourselves away from the world. And what God does is he sends an earthquake, but he wasn't in the earthquake. He sends a fire, but he wasn't in the fire. And then a still small voice. So it's almost like he's counteracting the numb that Elijah most certainly feels, that he'd have to penetrate through that. But then when Elijah hears the still small voice, he comes out to the cave to listen. He wraps himself in his mantle. And so the louder things, once they've passed, then Elijah makes his appearance. And so it's interesting that God allows Elijah to eat, drink, and rest, but he doesn't allow him to do is to hide away in the dark. So what God does is he gives him a task, he gives him a mission to anoint the next king. So he's giving him something to do instead of sitting around. But he says first, he tells him something that he needs to know. And that is that Elijah is not alone. 7,000 others have remained faithful to God. These are people that Elijah was formerly unaware of. And God is letting him know that everything is not pointless. Everything is not for nothing. There is yet purpose to be had. So we can't underestimate the role that support from others plays in recovery. And that would be the knowledge of these 7,000 other people, like-minded people that would be on his side, that would not attack him for serving, worshiping faithfully the one true God and refusing to worship the Baals. And also the knowledge that other people simply understand us in a profoundly personal way. So God gave him that gift when he was very depressed. And so in God's treatment of his severely depressed prophet, we don't see any harsh judgment for his sulking. We don't see any chiding for his supposed lack of faith. But instead, what God does is he addresses the underlying physical and emotional components that had led to Elijah's complaint that he wanted to die. So that was hydration, nutrition, rest, purpose and meaning with his calling, and also emotional support in the form of a community. Those were the various points that he addressed. So it would be very interesting to take notes and learn that even faith, strong faith like Elijah had, he was the same prophet that asked that it would not rain for 3 years. He had enough faith to believe that, and God granted his request. But even somebody with faith that strong Nevertheless, faith alone was not enough to heal his depression. And so that is the word to you today, and you can find me on my blog at gutsychristianity.com. I write daily on Facebook at facebook.com/Rosa Hopkins Writing, and we are going to play one of our songs for you by Joe and Rosa Hopkins, and catch us same time, same channel next week, and we'll be sure to meet here again to discuss a word from the scriptures. And this episode again was sponsored by Choice Writers blog writing service, where you can find elegant copy from the best writers. Again, that is choicewriters.com.
Give the giver credit, give your maker praise. The gentle breezes on your skin, warm sunshine rays. And when you live and stop to think of all the gifts he gave, give the giver credit, give your maker praise. Tender hands which cherish thee, whosever they may be. Husband, wife, a longtime friend, a mother elderly. The laughter of small children, the smile of a baby. All who make your life so rich are far from ordinary. Give the giver credit, give your maker praise. For gentle breezes on your skin, warm sunshine rays. And when you're living, stop to think of all the gifts he gave. Give the giver credit, give your maker praise. The joyful strains of music are what I like to hear. All the songs that I could want, he gave unto my ear. Lyric, verse, and melody, and themes of love divine, satisfies my yearnings deep in melody sublime. Give the giver credit, give your maker praise. For gentle breezes on your skin and warm sunshine rays. And when you live and stop to think of all the gifts he gave, give the giver credit, give your maker praise. To live in, a car we have to drive, clothes and shoes and all those things we need just to survive. But did we ever notice that the Lord with outstretched hand has given even more than this? He gave us all we have. Give the giver credit, give your maker praise. For gentle breezes on your skin, warm sunshine rays. And when you live and stop to think of all the gifts he gave, give the giver credit, give your maker praise. Give the giver credit, give your maker praise.